Just Branding. Podcast.
Hello and welcome to Just Branding. Today we have got a special guest, Nick Asbury, who's a creative writer, branding expert, and author of The Road to Hell. His book challenges the popular idea that brands can simply do well by doing good, and highlights how purpose-driven marketing can often miss the mark. So we're going to dive into why he thinks this approach may be causing more harm than good, and what brands should focus on instead. So welcome to the show, Nick.
It's very good to be here, Jacob and Matt. Yeah, thanks for the invite, and looking forward to it.
I'm excited about this one because, we love getting different perspectives on the show and, just enlightening people about different ideas and different, ways of doing things. And we've talked about purpose a lot on this podcast, but not necessarily from your perspective. So I'd love to learn a little bit about, who you are in your career first, just so we have some context, and then perhaps how you actually came to write a book on The Road to Hell, which you can share a little bit about as well.
Yes, well, I'm a writer. I'm a writer for in the world of branding and design, really. Yeah, I've slowly come to this point of writing the book over, I guess, 25 years. So I started out in the kind of direct response advertising world, writing a lot of kind of charity, direct mail stuff. That's how I kind of learnt my trade to begin with. And then I've kind of broadened out since then. For about 5 years in London, I was co-running an agency that did a lot of kind of branding and advertising work. I found I didn't particularly enjoy the actual management side of the business. I felt that wasn't really my strength. I just liked doing the writing and the ideas. And so I eventually kind of struck out on my own. And that is actually about 20 years ago. So ever since then, I've been kind of a writer for hire, working on branding projects, quite often at the stage where companies are branding themselves or rebranding themselves. So yeah, I'm kind of fairly deep in that world. And I, as well as being a practitioner, I've always kind of written about the industry as well, like in Creative Review magazine, various other places. And that's where I first kind of, I wrote an article about purpose. And I'm still deep in that rabbit hole.
All right. So were you a copywriter during this stage, or how are you? Okay. So when you say writer, it's like you're kind of doing both those well. Okay.
Yeah, no, I call myself a writer because alongside copywriting, which is my main day job, I've always tried to do other forms of writing as well. So kind of humorous writing, poetry, journalism, writing this book, so I write a lot of things, but yeah, copy is the main breadwinner.
Okay, good. Just want to clarify that. So just to set up the idea of purpose, I know you define it as like corporate purpose. You mentioned that in 2008, this is after the big financial crisis, it kind of took off. Why do you think that was the case?
Yeah, well, I don't know what your memories are of this period, but I remember it fairly vividly, working as a writer. There was this sense in the business world that there was kind of a crisis, really, a reputational crisis for business in general. I think the public were understandably annoyed that 2 trillion had been wiped off the global economy, and things were looking they were looking particularly dire in the UK, actually. We were teetering on the edge of chaos, really, and just pulled back from the brink. But yeah, you saw the Occupy Wall Street movement take off. There was quite a kind of anti-corporate mood globally, like the 99% against the 1%. And I actually remember working on briefs at this time where I was, working with quite senior people in big companies. And they were very aware of this crisis and the need to kind of change the narrative in some way. And I kind of saw how purpose became the alternative narrative that they wanted to push. And I think there was some good in that. I think it was good to remind people that businesses do actually have some positive side effects. They employ people, they generate growth and innovation and give us lots of things that we need and want. And, that's all good. And I think it was positive to remind people of, some of the many decent businesses out there doing useful things. But it was this extra claim that it's actually the purpose of business to actually be a kind of positive driver of social change that I remember right at the beginning just feeling that feels like a stretch. That's not really that's not what business is for. There's a reason we have for-profits. and we have not-for-profits, and there's just a kind of core logic, I think, that's quite important. It means purpose is not the right word for what we're talking about. And I think that may sound like a kind of semantic difference at first, but I think it actually does lead to some pretty big ethical mistakes. And it also, I think we saw over the ensuing years that it led to a lot of pretty bad marketing, lots of moral grandstanding, lots of kind of grandiosity, brands suddenly taking it on themselves to talk about these big social issues where you kind of thought, why is a fizzy drink talking about this? Why is a pack of biscuits talking about this? It just, something never felt right about it. And I think, I don't know how you two have felt about living through that period, but I feel we're just emerging from what you might call the purpose decade or the purpose 15 years.
Well, I looked up Simon Sinek's talk and when that came out, and it was around the same time. It's like the most watched TED talk ever, and it definitely probably propelled that along as well. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, I actually dedicate a pretty lengthy section in the book to Simon Sinek, and I think, to be fair to him, I think he is a brilliantly charismatic speaker, and he obviously hit the zeitgeist with that talk and with the book. I actually think the book itself is pretty, well, I lay into it pretty hard in my book.
We want to hear it. We want to hear it.
Well, it's partly based on he kind of invokes this brain science, the triune brain theory, which he says kind of maps onto I even forget the order of them now, but you've got the why and the how and the what in these concentric circles. And he kind of says this mimics the structure of the brain, and that's why it's so important. And he kind of says, this isn't my opinion, this is biology, and it's like, so he makes these very firm claims, and they're just not true. The triune brain theory that he's basing it all on was already discredited at the time that he was giving that TED talk. It was seen as a long debunked theory, really. And that doesn't in itself invalidate everything he said after that. But I think the case studies he uses of Apple and the Wright brothers and Martin Luther King, I think he just tells these very kind of post-rationalized stories where he's taking something successful and then he's projecting backwards and saying, oh, this is because they started with Y. And it's all just, I think, a bit of a stretch. And, you could equally look at countless failed companies and say that they started with Y too. So I don't think there's very much like hard science or hard evidence there. But I think he got a long way because he is just a very persuasive speaker and a very kind of charismatic personality. Yeah.
Nick, I want to come in here. It's Matt. Hi. Thanks for coming on the show. Two things. First of all, amazing to hear you contextualize the thinking from the Occupy movement. I remember that. I was living in Nottingham here in the UK. I don't live there anymore, but I was living, and I remember these people were like, there's a big market square in Nottingham. I think it's one of the biggest market squares in the UK. And there were all these people camping outside. And I remember I was working at a design agency at the time. I was thinking, what on earth are these people doing? And I went up to them and talked to them, and I was like discussing, and they were telling me about the 1% and all this stuff. And it sounds really plausible. So I then asked, what do you want me to do about that? Like, what do you actually want to happen? And they sort of looked at each other, these very hairy, tattooed, pierced people, a little bit blank. And I was like, hold on, you're out here, you're protesting. What tangible things are you looking to do? And why aren't we going through the usual channels of Parliament or whatever to get these done? Why are we out blocking the streets? So that was my impression of the movement. It was kind of like, I get that it feels unfair. I understand that that's how people feel, but I struggled personally to understand what it was we were all supposed to do about it, apart from moan and complain and feel like we were somehow entitled to something. Well, are we? I don't know. It's a difficult one. So I found that interesting. First, that was my first point. What were your thoughts on that whole movement and what we were supposed to do about it? Did you ever get to the bottom of it?
Well, yeah, funny enough, at the time it was all happening, I was interested in it and I had some sympathy with it, but I wasn't deeply engaged in it. I was more of a spectator from afar, I guess. It's actually only looking back and reading about the history and that I've now got what I think is a kind of deeper appreciation of that movement. And because they actually, even though the protesters themselves can't always articulate it themselves or may not be aware of it, there was actually a core idea at the heart of it, which they emailed all of their members saying, we need one single demand that will sum up our movement. What's it going to be? And they eventually arrived at this 3-word phrase, which was representation, not corporation. That was it should be better known, really, but that was the slogan of the movement.
I missed that completely.
Yeah, well, I think it was mainly in America that it had kind of purchase, because what they meant by that 3-word phrase was they wanted to kind of separate out business and politics, and the kind of big corporate funding of politics. They saw that kind of corrupting the democratic process. And I in retrospect, I have a lot of sympathy for that. And I think actually, weirdly, what's happened with purpose is, rather than they were asking for representation, not corporation, and we've ended up with representation by corporation. We've actually ended up with business and politics merging more closely than they've ever done before. And I think that's a strange shift, because, I've always thought of myself broadly being on the left. It was kind of a conventional left-wing view that you wouldn't want big corporations dictating the direction of society. But it feels like that has changed quite a lot in recent years.
Mm. I want to throw something else in, if I may, as well. So, yeah, interesting, because ultimately it comes down to what you're saying is this is rooted in a social movement, if you like, a social dissatisfaction. We're not political on this show, so we don't need to necessarily get into all the nuts and bolts unless Jacob really wants to. But I find that's where it was born. This, and I think you're right. Like, for that, brand, we didn't really talk about purpose so much in brands. But where I kind of have sympathy personally with Cynic is in that I think what marketeers do, and what they did, and see if you agree with this statement or not, is they took the concept. They were like, hey, we've got to have a purpose. And then, as you say, they tried to squeeze in social justice movements and all sorts of things into how they position brands and the marketing that they did. And I agree with you that there's huge sort of question marks over whether that's a great strategy, and you can talk to us about that in a minute and show us why it isn't. But where I have sympathy with Cynic, and a lot of the work that I do as a consultant, is motivating people internally, like a cultural organizational structure. And that's where personally I find having some form of purpose beyond making money, right, is helpful, because frankly, no one cares that those people want to get rich. No one cares that the company wants to turn over another X billion. No one gives a monkey's about that. No one cares the investors and want to exit in 3 years. That all of that corporate stuff, that businessy stuff, is fine, but it's not something that excites customers. It's not something that excites staff. So that's where personally I've found having a good purpose and simplifying something down to say, look, this is what we're about here, can help move brands forward. What's your thoughts on that?
My problem with that, which I think all sounds good in theory, but my problem is, what if the purpose that you're using to inspire your employees and attract them to join you, what if it's not really true? Which I think is often the case, because you get what we've had, the McKinseys, the Goldman Sachs, the Edelmans, the WPPs, that they've all been telling this purpose story over recent years as a way to attract, young employees. Yes, you could say it works in the sense that it does actually give them a bit of a good feeling that, hey, I'm not just working for a management consultancy or an ad agency. I'm actually kind of, helping to change the world in a positive way. But I think because it's not something they can ever truly deliver on. I think employees, they're not stupid, and they'll gradually kind of wake up to that and actually become more disillusioned. And we've actually had the rise of these trends like quiet quitting, and what's the other one they talk about? Lazy girl jobs. Have you heard of that hashtag on TikTok? I think it is. But there's this idea that people just want to find a job where actually they are really in it as a means to an end. They want good hours, they want good pay, they want to go home and pursue things they find really meaningful, like raising a family or being part of a community or traveling or writing poetry or whatever it is. And work is just a perfectly valid means to that end. And work doesn't have to be the be all and end all and the kind of purpose of your life. So, yeah, I just find, maybe it can work as an internal motivator, but I think it's a shallow one in a way that I think you're liable. Sorry, just to clarify one point as well. I think you can go for a job that is purely purpose driven. You can go and work for a charity. You can go and work, as a doctor in the NHS. You can go into politics. There are all sorts of kind of purpose driven careers where the material rewards might not be as high, although they sometimes are. But, you are kind of going for purpose more than pay. But I think there are other careers, like going into advertising or going into consultancy or banking or whatever it is, that they are just more, they're not as purpose driven. They just aren't. And I think we're telling a kind of cozy fantasy story if we try and convince ourselves otherwise. I know that can sound cynical, but I honestly, I think the cynicism is more on the other side in a way, in trying to persuade people that this is something it isn't.
Yeah.
All right. So you kind of talked about semantics before, in the definition. Yeah. So we often talk about definitions on this. So just for clarity here, how do you define, I guess, purpose or corporate purpose or whatever other terms you kind of use to?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. I think the first of 5 chapters in the book is all about trying to define what we're talking about. And I think actually a really simple way of defining it, which is what purpose advocates use as well, is the reason for being of an organization. So I think the strongest kind of fans of purpose would say it's not just a marketing campaign, it's not just a market positioning, it's actually a business deep kind of thing. It's the North Star that drives your business, and it's the reason that you do what you do every day. And that's, I sign up to that definition. That's the thing I'm kind of arguing against. And for me, it comes back to what I said earlier about the difference between for-profits and not-for-profits. If we're talking about the reason for being of an organization, what is it for? Then we do tend to define that very early on when people establish an organization. We ask them, is this a for-profit or is this a not-for-profit? And a lot rides on that. We tax them differently. We have different expectations of them. We expect not-for-profits to intervene in social issues and drive social change because we're happy they're not doing it for a profit. They're doing it for good reasons. And we haven't historically expected for-profit businesses to claim that same kind of social license to kind of wade into politics and sway it one way or another just because they happen to be a successful, profitable seller of widgets or whatever. For me, that's the core thing. And as I say, that's why it's more than semantics in a way. It's actually quite a consequential distinction, legally and ethically.
So maybe we're using some examples here. Often people quote Dove or Bud Light or Patagonia as good or bad examples. So maybe just to clarify these semantics, we could use some examples to talk about it.
Yeah, where to start? I think Patagonia is an interesting one because it is often cited as the leading case for purpose and the proof that it can work. But I think that's there's a number of interesting things about it. One is that, they are a for-profit company, and you can tell that kind of agonizes Yvon Chouinard, who's the founder, and he's often said that he's not very proud of being a businessman, and he recognizes that all of his environmental beliefs and ambitions are just permanently in tension with his need to just sell stuff and make a profit. And the real encapsulation of that was, if you remember that "Don't Buy This Jacket" ad, you may remember it. I think they ran it in the New York Times on Black Friday in 2009. I think it was like a full page ad with a picture of a jacket. Don't buy this jacket was the headline. And it was kind of advertising their mending and recycling kind of scheme and saying you don't need to buy as many things, you can just repair what you already have, which is all, it got them lots of good publicity. But in the 6 months afterwards, their sales went up 30%. So it's kind of, do you say that's a successful ad or not? Because in terms of selling stuff, which is what a for-profit business needs to do, it was massively successful. But in terms of trying to achieve the social goal of, reducing consumption, you could say it was a horrendous failure, and I think that tension has always been there in the business. And yeah, I've written at length about Patagonia, and yeah, without going too deep into it, I think that, they had this big PR story a couple of years ago about going purpose, they called it, when he, rather than floating the company as a PLC, he kind of signed it over to a family trust, and it was seen as being a very kind of noble move. But it was complicated once you dug into it. It was actually, he did actually avoid a hell of a lot of tax by signing it over to this family trust. And he kind of converted all of the financial power into enduring political power for him and his family. So now that they're a major funder of Democrat politics, which is fine, but usually when kind of right-wing business people start funding politics, we get worried and we say, oh, this is interfering with democracy. And but on principle, we should have the same objections with left-wing people that we may, it comes back to that issue of the separation of business and politics. So yeah, all of these questions tangle up together.
Yeah, it can get pretty complex. Like we often just see the facade and, it's like, oh, purpose and repair. But behind the scenes, like it definitely is complex. So
yeah,
I'm not sure where we should go from here, like maybe talking about the new approach or maybe talking about creativity and purpose. Like, I know you talk about this, creativity is pushed aside when you focus on purpose too much. So like, how does this happen and why does it matter?
I'm aware when you talk about this, it could all sound quite abstract and kind of big political stuff. I think to bring it kind of in some ways crashing to earth, you could talk about award schemes, advertising award schemes, which aren't the most important thing in the world, but I think they can be quite a good way to crystallize what's going on in the marketing industry and the ad world. And I think they've been a really interesting case in how purpose has shoved out creativity with kind of bad effects in a way, because in recent years, the 2022 actually was probably the peak where the Cannes Awards, they hand out the Grand Prix Awards every year. 17 out of the 21 creative categories, the top Grand Prix Award went to a kind of obviously purpose-driven project. And it was a similar story in the D&AD Global Awards, which are probably the second biggest. And that's kind of continued into this year as well. I think by someone's count, 66% of the Cannes Creative Awards went to purpose-driven projects. The organisers of these awards are very explicit about saying this is a good thing. They want judges to consider the social purpose of any given entry when they're judging, even though that's not one of the entry criteria. But the result is that we've had this wave of kind of purposeful stuff getting a lot of publicity, winning lots of awards. And at the same time, a guy called Peter Field in the UK, kind of marketing researcher, he published this paper called, I think it was called The Crisis of Creative Effectiveness, where he tracked all the award winners since 2009 up till today and found that there was a growing gap between the stuff that wins awards and the stuff that is actually effective in the marketplace. It used to be that they tracked each other quite closely, whereas now, there really is a large gap between what we celebrate and what actually works. And for me, that's, as I say, it's only award schemes. And you could say, well, that's not the end of the world. But I think it kind of typifies what's happening in the industry more broadly, where we're not celebrating the creativity that actually works for clients. And we're not telling clients, really business people, entrepreneurs, startup people, we need to tell them a good story about creativity and about what good strategy can do, what good branding can do, what good, advertising can do. And instead, we're trying to force everything into this purpose narrative and say that, hey, we'll help you find your purpose, and then we'll base all your advertising around that. And I just think we're doing a disservice to the businesses that really need effective marketing right now, because, you know, we are in well, certainly in the UK, we're not in very good economic times, and we could do with having some effective marketing to kind of help entrepreneurs to actually employ people and grow and get the economy going again.
Well, you mentioned cognitive empathy in your book, and you know, as an effective tool for purpose. Like, can you define what that is for our listeners and share how brands can use that for, you know, to their advantage?
Yeah, I kind of, you know, I've already talked about creativity as being an important part of the solution, I would say. And I think the other equally important thing is cognitive empathy. And it's the distinction with kind of what you would call, you have conventional emotional empathy, which is where you kind of feel the feelings of someone else. You feel sympathy for them. If they're sad, you're sad, you know, and you kind of, you share that emotional connection. Cognitive empathy is a term for a slightly separate thing, where it's about being able to see the perspective of someone else and to be able to see a problem from someone else's point of view without necessarily sharing it or endorsing it, you know. So in theory, you could have cognitive, or you could exercise cognitive empathy for, say, a Vladimir Putin, and you could see the war from his point of view without endorsing it, without defending it, but you're just trying that exercise of putting yourself in someone else's shoes and just trying to see the problem from that side. And in the marketing context, fortunately, we don't have to put ourselves in Vladimir Putin's shoes, but we can put ourselves in the shoes of the customer, you know. And I think what purpose has done is it's tended to make brands think about themselves a lot. They look inwards, they agonize about what are our values, what do we stand for, what's our purpose in the world, and they go through these long exercises of trying to define it. But the people who get forgotten, I think, are the customers, where what you really want to be doing is saying, well, we've got all these customers out there. Some of them are Trump voters, some are Biden voters, some are right-wing, some are left-wing, some don't care about politics, some do. Vastly diverse audiences who buy most products and services. And I think brands need to get back in the habit of seeing themselves from an outside point of view rather than being too wrapped up in themselves. And I think I think marketers should take pride in a way in being able to see lots of different perspectives rather than being really single-minded about them, their values and their kind of mission that they're on. I think they should take pride in being able to say, you know, like if a client comes to you as a marketer and says, look, the world isn't making sense. I want to sell this washing powder. I know like half of my market all voted Trump a couple of years ago or whatever. What's going on? And I feel as a marketer, you should be able to give them answers. You should be able to give them some insight into, not that you need to be a political expert necessarily, but you just need to be able to tell them, well, look, Gen Z are thinking like this, or Trump voters are thinking like this, and kind of tell them what that means for their brand and for their position in the world. Yeah, I think we've lost some of that skill over the years.
I'm curious, like how would you understand that though? Like if you're looking at, let's say, the voters, how are you using that information to then dictate like how you position a brand, or are you just using it as information to understand what not to do? Like how do you actually use all those points of view?
Yeah, well, I think the reason I guess I bring all of that up is that the core argument of purpose tends to be that you do take into account the politics of your audience, particularly a younger Gen Z audience, and therefore you embrace purpose and social progressive causes because that's what they want. So it's seen as a big justification of the purpose movement that, you know, this is what the public is clamoring for. And I think by being curious about the world and other perspectives and looking into it yourself, you can actually work out pretty quickly that that just isn't the case. You know, actually people, including young people, are extremely diverse in their politics, a surprising amount of younger people are actually right-wing or certainly not left-wing in their politics. And, you can see that as a good or a bad thing, but it is just the case if you look at political surveys and voting patterns in recent years. There's actually been quite a drift towards the right among younger people. So I think that's where it matters, is if you've got the kind of very vocal, influential purpose movement saying you need to push your brands in this direction in order to keep up with the times. I think it's important to have the knowledge to be able to push back and say, well, actually, no, that's not what's really happening.
Okay.
Otherwise, you end up becoming the next Bud Light or the next whatever it is. You kind of misread the public mood, and you can quite rapidly find yourselves in a bit of a mess.
So Nick, what I think I'm hearing from you, and I think I 100% agree with this, is that what we're saying is I think what you're saying is, and forgive me if I'm wrong, that purpose is okay if it's not too grandiose, if it's kind of focused on customer value, what the customer actually wants. So say like washing powder, right? So one washing powder company could say, well, we're here to, basically champion left-wing, social justice movements, right? You're saying, oh, way too far, you're a washing powder. But what if they said something like, our purpose is to help families feel confident in the clothes that they wear, for example, and that becomes an internal mantra that everything they're doing is focused on confidence and making sure that, do you see what I mean? So that's how I would use it. What are your thoughts on that? Because that's customer value there, not some sort of grandiose religious sort of.
No, I think you're totally right to make that distinction between, you could call it kind of lowercase purpose versus uppercase purpose, where it's like, I would say you're absolutely right. Of course, if you're a washing, and this goes back as old as, as long as business itself. And it's not like that's a new thing. Brands have always understood that if you want to sell, washing powder, you don't just talk about the kind of chemical constituents of the powder or the price or whatever. You sell, in old language, you would sell benefits, not features. You would say,
don't sell the bed, sell a good night's sleep.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, you might say, well, rather than just saying this gets your clothes clean, you can say, yeah, this makes your family healthy and fresh and whiter than white and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's all fine. And that's all, we've always had language to talk about that stuff. We've talked about brands having propositions and having, essences or ideas or positionings or whatever it is. I think the thing is, if you start calling that purpose, you're actually just inviting confusion with the wider purpose debate, which is because the whole reason purpose with a capital P was a new idea, if you like, in 2009, was the political dimension and the social dimension. That's what made it new. Without that dimension, it's just the same as everything else we've been talking about for years. So I would just say to people, the people who've made the point you've just made, which I think is perfectly right and reasonable, I would just say, almost just for tactical reasons, don't use the word purpose for that, because you're just constantly going to get wrapped up in this confusion where people think what you mean is, purpose, the kind of stuff that gets awarded in purpose awards and, gets talked about in the press. I think that's what most people mean by purpose these days.
What other word would you use instead?
Well, maybe it sounds a bit old school, but I think proposition is a really good word. It was actually one of the first words marketers used to talk about branding. We used to talk about the USP, the unique sales proposition. But I think proposition is a more honest word for what brands actually do. Because a proposition is something that you put forward to people and you wait for their response. And you're interested in their response, and you can change it over time. If market conditions change, maybe a new competitor comes in, you can change your proposition. You can say, okay, now we want to propose this. But purpose suggests it's something kind of etched in stone and, in the DNA of your business. And you're not really interested in what the response is, because this is this is your purpose. So I just think proposition is it's a more grounded word, and it doesn't get you too carried away with yourself in a way that I think purpose does.
So if the corporate purpose model with the capital P is flawed, what other alternatives should brands focus on instead?
I don't know. Have you ever come across a guy called Paul Feldwick? He's a great writer about, I think his most recent book is called Why Does the Peddler Sing? He wrote another one called The Anatomy of Humbug. He's a British advertising guy who's written these brilliant kind of histories of advertising, and also they're very readable books about the kind of theory of advertising and what makes it work. And he basically comes to the conclusion that it's really about kind of showmanship and fame creation. And I think even though he comes at it from a different angle, he ends in a similar place to Byron Sharp, who I'm sure you know, who also talks about, you know, the power of distinctive assets, the kind of goal of creating physical and mental availability, which is what ultimately drives purchasing decisions that people make. And I think that's, as I say, they've both arrived at that from different angles, but I think they are close to a kind of truth about branding and marketing, which is, it is about just competing for that mental space in people's minds. And it can be as simple as just continually prodding people and saying, hey, we're Coca-Cola, we're the red one, we're not the blue one. You know, it's kind of so that the next time someone's picking up a drink, it's just, there's something, some synapse that fires in their brain that says, oh yeah, I'll grab the red one. I like that one. And I think a lot of branding and marketing does come down to those kind of, it's great creativity, it's great use of craft and ideas and lateral thinking. And that's really what carves you out a place in people's minds. Because in the end, people aren't going into the supermarket pondering, well, which brand should I support today? You know, they're just looking at what's on the shelf, what leaps out, what they bought last time, what a friend said was good or whatever, what they saw an ad for last night. Yeah, and I think that's truly the way that marketing and advertising works. And I just think we need to embrace that with confidence, really, rather than trying to make out it's about something else.
There's a really great Peter Drucker quote, which I love, right? And Peter Drucker, obviously, was he 60s? I think he was, maybe 50s.
I think so, yeah.
He wrote something along the lines of, the purpose of business is to create a customer, right? So which ladders perfectly into your point about proposition, right? The purpose isn't some sort of social movement or anything beyond that. Like, if we're being honest, companies exist to make money, to make customers. So, you know, I think that there's something inherently true in that. And I think you're right. We've moved as an industry, perhaps as an, you know, away from something which is honest and truthful. And we get found out all the time. Companies get found out all the time. Customers leave. You know, I remember when Starbucks didn't pay their tax, you know, there was a massive boycott at Starbucks. You know, one of their values was like, wasn't their purpose like nurturing the human spirit or something? Yes. It's like, well, yeah, and then you're not paying your tax. So thanks, guys. You know, we get found out when we get really grandiose. And I think, I think you've got a really good point around, let's focus on proposition, let's focus on value that we're putting forward to the market, and we're letting the market decide ultimately whether or not.
Yeah. I think it's also a really kind of positive story about what really makes businesses successful. I was thinking about this earlier today. When you look at the real stories of lots of really successful businesses, it's just a succession of kind of creative leaps and nimble kind of moves where it's kind of opportunism that means the real story of a business isn't driven by some kind of why or some kind of purpose, but just by a lot of thinking on your feet and reacting to circumstances. And you see it with, like, got a list of them here. Instagram started as a whiskey app. YouTube started as a dating site. Shopify started as a snowboard company. You know, even Airbnb, as you can see in the name, started with airbeds, you know, and then it's just by not being tied down by some idea of your purpose, but actually just being open and just thinking, where are the opportunities? I think that's where successful businesses really happen. It's by kind of chance and instinct and, being open to possibility rather than kind of narrowly pursuing this goal.
Are there any brands that come to mind that like balance this nicely in your opinion?
Well, I was thinking of they've been in a bit more trouble recently, I would say, but Nike are often cited, by all sorts of people as, one of the most powerful brands ever. But there is a really interesting story about how they arrived at that "just do it" line, which, I imagine Simon Sinek would say, well, they defined their why with "just do it," and then it's been a success story ever since. But it didn't happen like that, and it actually happened in a much more messy, accidental kind of way. They were working on well, first of all, Nike was already a very successful business by the kind of late 80s when Just Do It came along. But also they were just working, there was just one campaign they were working on, Wyden and Kennedy. Dan Wyden was working on it, I think. And it was just a purely visual campaign, lots of really nice photos of athletes kind of shot from a distance, running across a barren landscape or whatever it was. And it was about to go to press, I think, as just a visual campaign. And Dan Whedon said, I really think we need some kind of line to pull it together and just make it feel a bit like a campaign. And people were apparently arguing back, saying, no, it doesn't need it. And he said, no, let's just, we'll put Just Do It on, just put that on all of them. And that'll just pull it together in some way. And it was just a bit of an afterthought. And yet that became, something about that chimed with people. It felt right. It felt like it kind of captured this mood, this personality, this distinctive positioning in the market. And it really stuck. But you don't arrive at that through a kind of purposeful, rational, strategic process. You arrive at it by being creative and being open and just doing what kind of feels good. And I think Nike at their best have been good at doing that. They've kind of, acted a bit on gut and a bit on instinct and just employed really good creative people and let them do what they do really well. So I think they're an example of a good business that shows the power of creativity. But there are many more you could point to, I think.
Yeah, and it's also like there's ups and downs. Like with Nike, they had the whole.
I know they've certainly had like supply chain problems, and there's been accusations of slave labor.
Slave labor.
Yeah, a lot of that issue is the supply chains are so complex, particularly across global structures. I often counsel my clients, like you were saying, you've got to be so careful. We're making value statements and all this stuff. Has anyone actually done due diligence across the supply chain? Because if we haven't, we shouldn't really put something out there, that we don't really know about.
It does set you up for a fall, I think. Yeah, if you build your whole brand on this kind of moral superiority, then it's going to hit even harder when a negative press story comes along.
I don't know if you come across this, but I often run workshops on things like this, and often people, the climate change thing will always come up. Like, yes, one of our values is to, hasten the transition to the green side of things. And then you're like, okay, so how are we actually, what are you actually doing? Oh, we're probably not doing anything. Like, are you actually even tracking the carbon footprint of, everyone? Do you know how many plane rides that everybody makes? No. So you're just virtue signaling, right? So I see that all the time. Supply chain is a big area. ESG and social, the kind of the green side of things is massive. Brands are going to get caught out if they're not. Well, they do get caught out frequently. So
and I think there has been a bit of a mood shift in maybe the last kind of year or two. I think brands are waking up to this idea that people aren't really buying it. They, exactly as you just said, people are kind of seeing through these green claims. It's being called greenwashing. And I think companies just aren't getting the kind of, maybe in the early days of purpose, some of these messages did feel kind of fresh and did lead to some PR benefits. But I think increasingly it's backfiring. And I think also because we're living in quite tough economic times, you're seeing a lot of companies. The biggest example is probably Unilever in the UK and Europe, where they've been an incredibly vocal, kind of purpose-driven organization. They're the people behind Dove and Ben and Jerry's and brands like that. And they've just a few years ago, their chief exec was saying that brands without a purpose have no place at Unilever. And since then, he's the one who's actually left. And the new chief exec is saying that purpose has actually been a kind of unwelcome distraction. They've been trying to force fit all of their brands into this purpose thing, and it's not been working. And Unilever generally has been underperforming in the marketplace for the last kind of 10 years or so. So there's quite a reality check going on there. And I think it's a good thing, really. I know some people will think, oh, no, but isn't that bad news that we're not talking about climate stuff or social issues as much? But I actually think it's healthier to have an honesty about this stuff and about the limitations of what business can do, because I think the real answers to climate change are, you need legislation, you need international agreements, you need maybe a carbon tax that actually changes the rules of the game for everyone. You can't just rely on the goodwill of a few purposeful companies. You've got to actually have more systemic change than that if you want things to really change.
All right, Nick. Well, we've talked about purpose with a capital P and creativity and cognitive empathy. Is there anything else from your book that you'd like to share with the audience, like any key takeaways they should keep in mind when they're going about their brand strategy?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of things I'll mention. The first thing is I would really like people just to feel it's okay to talk about purpose, because I think it often is seen as a slightly kind of fraught subject where if you maybe object to a purpose-based strategy, it's maybe seen as being a bit kind of, oh God, so you don't support, climate action, or you don't support gender equality or something. And of course, that's not the case. You can support all those things very seriously, as I do, but still be against it as a kind of marketing strategy and a business strategy. So I do think there's a certain groupthink with purpose where a lot of people, both client side and agency side, just feel they have to kind of toe the purpose line because that's the way things are these days. And I think actually if people feel just a bit more comfortable talking about it, you may well find that actually a lot of people quietly agree with you and actually do think, yeah, some of this stuff is a bit exaggerated, and maybe we would be better off pursuing a different approach. And so if nothing else, I would like the book just to maybe spark some of those conversations. Yeah, and I guess the one other thing I would mention is I offer kind of 3 signposts at the end of the book for things, kind of 3 principles you could apply to anything you do, any kind of marketing campaign you put out there. I somehow, without deliberately doing it, they all begin with H, and it's humor, humility, and humanity. And I think those 3 things, and they are kind of related, I think they're good touchstones for anything you put out there. I think it's good to have a sense of humor about what you do. I don't think it means all your ads have to be funny or anything, but I think it's good to have a sense of humor just in the way you run meetings and the way you operate your business, And if someone sits in a business meeting and says, our purpose is to elevate the world's consciousness, as WeWork claimed, I think it's good if someone laughs at that and says, come on, we can't say that. So I think it is good to have a sense of humor. It keeps you grounded. And I think humility relates to that. I think there are so many marketing campaigns that actually are full of grandiosity and setting your brand up as the hero and the kind of leader of the conversation and the leader of a social movement. And I think it's actually much better to be a bit more grounded, actually recognize you're not solving all the world's problems, you've got a limited influence. And I think that can actually just be a very persuasive thing for people. It's actually quite charming in a way when people acknowledge their limitations, and it's healthy to think, yeah, at the end of the day, we are just a washing powder. It's like, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's perfectly noble to sell washing powder, and people need it, and you're keeping lots of people employed, and they're feeding their families, and it's all good. But it is just washing powder. And then humanity, I just think a lot of the purpose conversation is about corporations and corporate values and what the brand stands for, what the brand believes. And I think it actually does end up disempowering individual people, because even within a company like Unilever or Dove or Ben and Jerry's, all the individual people are going to have their own opinions and their own purposes and their own points of view. And I think it's good as a business to kind of recognize that and not try and force them all into one agenda. And equally, I think it's good to recognize the humanity of your customers and, you know, the fact that they've all got their own lives and their own priorities. And so, yeah, I would like to kind of recenter humans and human rights and, human perspectives rather than talking about companies and corporate values.
Well, thank you so much, Nick.
Yeah, I was going to say the same, Jacob. I was going to say, if folks want to hear any more from you or you, how do we find out more about you? How do we follow you? How do we get hold of your book?
Well, thank you for asking. There's a little-known bookshop called Amazon that seems to be quite good at distributing.
Oh, really?
books.
Never heard of it.
Never heard of it. I don't know what their purpose is.
They are... yeah, I mean, you can find it through other outlets, Waterstones, Barnes and Noble, but Amazon do seem to be the main place for people, and there's a Kindle edition as well you can buy. That aside, I have a Substack, nickasbury.substack.com, where I write kind of fairly long articles about all this kind of stuff. And I've made a fair bit of noise on LinkedIn recently. If you want to kind of look me up on there, quite often get into long conversations about brands and purpose and politics and creativity and all sorts of things. So do look me up on there.
Thank you, Nick. And yeah, everyone listening, stay tuned for our next episode. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks again.
Thanks, Nick.